Today I want to talk about the moment where many well-intentioned storytellers cross a line, not because they're dishonest, but because they're convinced that their message matters more than the truth. Storytellers can hold enormous narrative power without turning story into an instrument of control. How do you refuse to turn it into a weapon, even when you're convinced that you're right, even when doing so would be easy and popular and most of all, emotionally satisfying? But then the question becomes how and when a story becomes a weapon. Well, a story becomes a weapon the moment that it stops serving truth. When it stops revealing reality and starts enforcing a conclusion. Sometimes we can see this most clearly inside stories themselves. So let's take the story of The Dark Knight. Well, what makes The Dark Knight such a useful example here is that it unintentionally exposes the moral danger it's trying to justify. The lesson here isn't that Batman is evil, it's that even heroic intentions can corrupt story. Gotham faces a crisis of truth. Harvey Dent, who has been the symbol of hope and justice and moral integrity, has become Two-Face. And now he's committed murder. He's embraced vengeance. He's no longer the hero that Gotham believed him to be. Batman knows this. Commissioner Gordon knows this. And together, they make a decision. Together, they decide that the truth is too dangerous for the public to know. The public can't handle it. So what do? They construct a false narrative. Batman agrees to take the blame for Harvey Dent's crimes. Harvey's image is therefore preserved, and then the public is fed a lie. Why? For their own good. And the irony is that the lie is told in the name of preserving hope. But it actually rests on a low view of humanity. And that belief is what makes the lie feel necessary. Within the world of Gotham, this decision is framed as noble. It's sacrificial. It's necessary. We, the audience, are supposed to believe that Batman did the right thing. That is the exact moment that this story, within the story, becomes a weapon. Because the story has stopped revealing reality, and instead it has started to manage perception. You've already crossed that line from being a truth teller to narrative management, from storytelling to propaganda. Notice the posture. First and foremost, Batman and the authorities decide. They are the ones who decide what the public is and is not capable of handling. So what does that mean? Well, it means they've just placed themselves above the people that they serve. And the underlying assumption is actually deeply cynical. Because what they're saying is that ordinary people cannot be trusted with the truth. So at the end of the day, this isn't compassion, it's paternalism. Now, why does this matter for storytellers? When truth is sacrificed for control, the story becomes a weapon. And guess what? It always feels justified. But that's exactly the danger for storytellers, because weaponized story feels righteous. This is the part that most conversations skip, because here's the truth. The people that are most likely to weaponize story aren't necessarily the nihilists or the people that want to control the world. They're usually people who want to correct injustice or protect victims or expose corruption. They want to wake people up. And when the stakes feel existential and important, restraint suddenly feels irresponsible. This is the moment when people say something like, well, we don't have time for nuance. We just need to tell people what's going on. Or now isn't the moment to ask questions. What is the difference between moral clarity and moral coercion? And this difference matters Well, moral clarity emerges when truth is honestly pursued. Moral coercion, on the other hand, is when truth is imposed in advance. The moment story becomes a means to rush to this end, truth becomes negotiable and not necessary. Nuance becomes expendable. And reality becomes raw material. At that point, story is no longer art, it's a strategy. This distinction between moral clarity and moral coercion can actually show up clearly in storycraft, which is what I'm going to convey to you. Because I recently critiqued a manuscript which was set during the abolition of slavery in England. Now, one of the central characters was a slave owner, but the woman he loved was morally opposed to slavery. Now, this is exactly the kind of ideological conflict that should produce powerful drama. But here's where the story struggled. The author already knew slavery was evil, because it is. But instead of letting the story wrestle its way there, the author assumed that conclusion. Therefore, the slave-owning character didn't actually believe that what he was doing was right. And therefore, all of the arguments he put forth were flimsy and half-hearted, almost even apologetic. He already knew that slavery was morally wrong, so he was just being morally lazy, and he was just compromising and doing it for profit because he wanted to do it. But that's historically not how it worked. People who defended slavery didn't see themselves as villains. They made arguments based on philosophical beliefs and economic beliefs and even theological ones. And in fact, they were compelling. These arguments were, of course, wrong, but they were real, and other people were really torn by them. And abolitionists, by the way, didn't win by ignoring those arguments. They won by confronting and overcoming them. When the author in this case originally refused to articulate these types of arguments, something subtle happened in the story. The story stopped investigating reality, and it started enforcing a conclusion. Instead of allowing the audience to wrestle with how did intelligent, moral people justify slavery, the story told them, don't worry, even the slave owner knows he's wrong. That's not clarity, that's control. The verdict arrived before the inquiry, and the result wasn't a stronger moral story, it was a weaker one, because the audience was never invited to think, only to agree. Moral clarity trusts that truth can withstand examination, but moral coercion is afraid it won't. Here's the really interesting thing about all this. Because all of it happens as a result of a lie that storytellers are telling themselves. And that lie is that they're not actually manipulating, right? They're just using the story for good. Once the goodness of the cause justifies the method, the story is no longer accountable to reality. Which leads me to 5 commitments of truthful storytelling. And this is what integrity looks like in practice. Number 1, you begin with reality, not a message. Now this is confusing because theme often looks like message. If you start with a message, reality will be arranged to serve it. If you start with a theme and then commit to telling the reality of that story, wherever it goes, then the message has to earn its place. So at the beginning of your story, ask yourself, are you exploring what is, or are you explaining what you want people to believe? Commitment number 2, let your antagonists make sense to themselves. Villains don't think they're villains. You need to understand their motivation. And that doesn't excuse their behavior. It just means we need to understand where they're coming from, right? This brings us to commitment number 3. preserve cause and effect morality. Truthful stories insist that actions have costs and that people must be personally responsible for those costs. False stories overlook personal consequences and only point blame. Commitment number 4. We need to refuse to bypass discernment with emotion. Emotion isn't the enemy. Manipulating emotion is the enemy. And this is exactly why memes are so powerful and so dangerous. Because a meme doesn't invite investigation. It delivers a verdict, and it compresses a complex reality into a single emotional punch. And by the time your rational mind catches up, your emotional allegiance has already been secured. So if your story functions like a meme, then it's no longer pursuing truth. It's managing compliance. All right. Number 5, trust the audience with complexity. Truthful stories believe that the audience has a capacity to think for themselves. But propagandists don't trust the audience. They simply manage them. And this is a great way for you to test yourself. If you don't trust that your audience can wrestle with truth, if you don't trust that the audience can disagree and think for themselves, then frankly, you shouldn't be telling stories. Why does all this matter? Story has become one of the last places where people learn how truth behaves. Not what to think, but how truth emerges, how truth resists manipulation, and it survives pressure. That means storytellers are participating in moral formation, whether they intend to or not. And that is not a small responsibility. That's power. And power always comes with temptation. So, here's a framework for storytellers. Before you write, before you release any story, ask yourself, am I starting with truth? Or is it just a message? Does my antagonist make sense to himself? Have I preserved complexity where it exists? Do consequences emerge honestly? And would this story still stand even if my audience disagreed with me? If the answer is no, then pause. That doesn't mean stop writing. It means return to humility. Rethink what you're doing. Story is powerful, which means the greatest courage a storyteller can show is not conviction, but restraint. If you have found this episode interesting, would you please like, comment, and subscribe? And please share this with somebody else that you think might benefit from this episode. In the meantime, thank you for listening to the Storyteller's Mission with Zena Dell Lowe. May you go forth inspired to change the world for the better through story.